All right, welcome again everyone to Archbold's Thursday seminar series. Today, 3 Archbold staff members demonstrate their techniques for making memorable shots of the good, the bad, and the ugly in nature. First, I have some reminders. All participants are muted and your video cameras are off. You may submit your questions using the Q&A button along the bottom of the screen for our panelists to answer after the lecture. Use the chat button to communicate with panelists and attendees. Make sure you panelists and attendees so everyone will see your comment. Archbold's Executive Director, Dr. Hillary Swain, is here to introduce our speakers. Hillary?
Thank you very much, Laura, and this is certainly my pleasure. I think one of the interesting things about Archbold moving to our Zoom meetings is we've realized our potential to offer many, many different types of outreach. And today, the outreach is one on conservation photography techniques. Sometimes people ask, what is conservation photography? And I'm pretty sure our speakers today are going to say that. The definition is furthering environmental and cultural conservation through ethical photography. And we're very lucky to have 3 very different speakers today, all associated with Archbold, and I'm going to introduce them each in turn now, and then they're going to give their individual presentations. I'll provide some bridging comments as we switch from one to the other, and then we will have a panel session at the end, so I strongly encourage you to stay on and ask some of your technique or even your ethical or philosophical questions about conservation photography. So the first speaker is going to be Reed Bowman, who is obviously has an eminent career in avian ecology. He's the director of our Avian Ecology Program. But Reed has a wonderful eye for photography and has supplied Archbold with many of our quintessential Archbold Biological Station shots over the years, some of them award-winning. And he's going to talk to us today about when you left your real camera at home, or maybe you don't even have a real camera, with Reed Bowman. The second speaker is going to be Dustin Angell, who his appointment here is Director of Education, but Dustin actually has a professional background in photography, and Dustin at Archbold has elevated our photography, particularly of people, to levels that we never envisioned, never mind articulated. And he's going to talk about, in particular, when you use a wide-angled lens. So Dustin combines his photography skills with his really exceptional education prowess, and we're very lucky to have him working here. And the third person, who is a volunteer with Archbold, but worked for many years as he headed the Ridge Ranger program for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, is Bill Parken, who is taking up the gauntlet of conservation communications at Archbold. And I think, you know, his photo essay, which is going to be about the popular topic of litter, is going to really talk to us about, you know, sort of messaging with conservation photography. So at this point, I know Reed will be bringing up his presentation. We'll do Reed Bowman, Dustin Angell, Bill Parken, and then we'll have an open panel. And Laura, I think, will be navigating the time. So I'm going to hand over to Reed and thank the 3 of you very much for offering to do this and for adding some new dimensions to our lives and all of our stakeholders' lives. So thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. So as Hillary mentioned, I'm speaking about when you left your good camera behind. And there we go. All of us are naturalists. We all spend a lot of time in the woods. And because we spend time outside, we see more than the average person. And capturing what we see and being able to package it in such a way so it's accessible to everybody to learn the story about those images is the backbone of conservation biology. But what happens if you leave your big DSLR behind? Undoubtedly, you have an equally good camera with you in your cell phone. We all carry our cell phones in our pocket, whether we're out doing biological field work or watching birds. We've got that with us all the time. And so if you panic because you see this beautiful scene, but you don't have your camera with you, you have a cell phone. And the trick is how to make cell phones as good as the images that you get from your DSLR. And it's actually a lot easier than you think. And I'm going to focus on how do you maximize the quality of the images from your cell phone. So first of all, conservation photography, as Hillary mentioned, is about the story behind pictures of the natural world, and often its relationship to humans. But an image is more powerful than a description. And a beautiful and thoughtful image often evokes appreciation and empathy, and also a personal relationship with the subject. So taking the time to capture the highest quality image you can, even if it's just with a cell phone, lends that picture to conservation photography and to the appreciation and understanding of nature throughout the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get the most out of your cell phone. And I'm going to start with composition, because I'm not an artist. I don't have artistic training, but I learned early on that composition is the backbone to getting a really high quality picture. And there's a whole bunch of different rules of composition. The rule of thirds, dividing your photograph up into different thirds, leading lines, fill the frame, simplify. You can read them there. I'll talk about each of them sort of individually with some of the images that I present. But what's the first thing you can do with your cell phone to help you in your goal of beautiful composition? And that's turn on your grid. You notice this image of a cell phone has a grid superimposed over the top of the photo. Well, that's actually there because I've turned it on the camera, and it helps you to compose. So you can see in this particular picture, the people are in the lower left third. They're at that intersection of the third. And the foreground takes up the bottom third. The midground is sort of the middle third, and the background is the sky. So this photograph also achieves depth. It's got all three of those, foreground, midground, and background. It allows you to see the depth of a landscape and appreciate its vastness. But I'm going to talk about each of these sort of in turn, and different examples of how you can improve your cell phone photography. Well, the first thing people realize when they get a cell phone is how easy it is to create panoramas. Point and just sort of move it around, and you instantly get these beautiful, beautiful panoramas. But notice in this panorama, the right side is quite dark, the left side is quite light. That actually makes panoramas a little bit more complicated, because you're either going to overexpose one side or underexpose the other. But cell phones also offer the opportunity for exposure lock. So if you put your finger on the screen of your cell phone, you can lock the exposure for a particular place. So in this case, I locked the exposure in the dead middle of the photograph so that it wasn't too bright at one end or too dark at the other end. And that's a very simple tool. Again, all you have to do is touch the screen where you want to focus, but then hold it there for a second or two, and you'll see exposure lock suddenly comes on. And that's the best way to get panoramas that are well balanced. But panoramas don't have to be these wide sweeps of landscape. So this picture looks a lot like a wide angle lens, but it was beyond what I could do with my cell phone. So I did a panorama to get the foreground tree and the background tree and the sun. I particularly wanted the sun. Well, this is a story I was interested in telling about how pines live on the edge of seasonal ponds. But it was also quite dark in the foreground and quite bright up in the top. I could have used auto lock, but cell phones have another feature called HDR, high dynamic range. And in this case, what it does is you just simply push a button, and you can see in this example, it takes 3 images, one that's dark, one that's light, and one that's perfect. And it balances all those and readjusts the exposure so that you don't get too dark shadows or too bright highlights. And that's a great tool in getting really balanced exposures with your cell phone. The other thing is that conservation is all about people. It's about the environment and how we protect it or how we conserve it. So throw people into your pictures. It doesn't have to just be nature. This is taken south of Taos, New Mexico. And I wandered out into the sagebrush to take this picture of the storm and the tree. But my wife thought it was better to have a picture with me in it. And this is the one I've ended up using all the time. So people are important. The other thing is that environments are dynamic. They're often moving. And how do we capture that movement? So this is a picture up at Washington Oaks State Park where the rocks come out at the beach. And you can see it's dynamic. There's lots of movement. But the picture doesn't really convey that. It's static and flat. However, iPhones have a new feature called Live View, which actually takes a short video and then turns it into an image. And so in this case, you can see the movement. It's dynamic. You could do this with a long exposure with your DSLR, but it's harder to do with a cell phone. But now we have that opportunity. The waves are breaking, the waves are blurry. You can see the movement that exists in nature in that photograph. So Live View, it's another tool that's really useful for nature photography. And then environments are really dynamic, but don't forget that cell phones often have fantastic videos. And in this case, I hope it's working for everybody. I wanted to capture the feel and sound and movement of a rainstorm in the scrub. And they can just be short little clips that bring you that movement and the sound to convey the feeling that you had while you were out in that environment. Now I'm going to talk about a couple other things, focus and background and something called bokeh. Well, this is of a cactus, also in New Mexico. Now on the left, you can see everything is pretty sharp, the flowers and the cactus. If I wanted to tell a story about cactus, this is perfect because it has the flowers and it has the spines and everything. But if I wanted to tell a story only about the flowers, you can see on the other side, the background is completely blurred out. Only the flowers are in bright focus. And that is a little bit bokeh, that sort of feeling that you get from the blurred out background. But it makes two different photographs. Neither is good or bad. It just emphasizes different things. And you can do that with your cell phone. With an iPhone, you can do it with what we call portrait mode. So it's designed primarily for taking people portraits, but it allows you to adjust the background. When portrait mode is on, you can adjust the background so it's blurred out. It also offers different lighting modes to simulate studio or nature portrait photography. But we can use this in nature, and it's fantastic. So what if you don't have an iPhone though? There are apps that can be used in place of doing it in camera. So this is a photograph I took in my backyard. It looked like the one on the left when I took it, but after I took it, I imported it into a program that changed the focus by essentially simulating a different aperture. So I took it with a very small aperture, which means you have a great deal of depth of field. Everything's in focus. But then in the app, I changed the aperture to wide open, which has very shallow focus. And now everything's in the background is blurred out. Again, change of emphasis, but you don't have to have an iPhone to do it. Another great opportunity with cell phones is macro photography. Now, this is a close-up of a flower that's only about 3 inches wide. And I zoomed in. So use zoom rather than try and get close, because you'll find out that it does a much better job of high quality images. And I really wanted to capture the pattern of the little stems, the little florets that hold those individual flowers. Now, if I was doing this with a good camera, I might use a tripod, but there's ways to get steady photographs. You can use your self timer. That allows you, you don't have to be pushing a button at the same time the photograph goes out. Or you can do it in a burst. Just simply hold your button down and it'll take 10 or 15 pictures, one of which might be really sharp. And also this is an example of simplifying. I could have stepped 3 feet back and taken a picture of the whole flower, but I wanted to zoom in on just the topic of my subject. This is another example of simplify, but also perspective. Cell phones are so easy to get down right on the ground. So I've been doing a whole story of mushrooms that grow in Michigan. So in this case, I got down low, put the cell phone on the ground. I got this beautiful light hitting the mushroom. I only focused on the mushroom, the background's blurry, and it's simplified. Now you don't always have to do things in camera. This is an image I made from 3 photographs of mushrooms that I wanted. And I put it into a package that allows you to make a collage to just show you what the surfaces of different mushrooms look like and the amazing diversity that exists there. So you can be as creative as you want with your cell phone imagery. And lastly, there is always a lot of movement. So as I mentioned before, you can use burst mode to simulate a tripod, but you can also use burst mode to catch movement. So in this case, this is actually 1 year in an extreme drought in the scrub. And the Florida scrub jays were doing really different things. And I watched a termite flight, a whole bunch of termites coming out of the ground, and all these jays aggregating and trying to pick these termites. I had no idea how to capture it. And finally, I just stood there and I held my shutter down for a good long time. I ended up taking well over 100 photographs. And this was just one out of that hole. And it captured the jay right in the center, flying, trying to pluck a termite out. But then if you look around this picture, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other jays flying, their eyes all in focus. And that was just by using the burst mode as a way to try and capture something that was so fleeting. I might have been able to capture it with a video, but this turned out to be the best way to capture something that would be extraordinarily difficult to capture even with a DSLR. So lastly, you're not limited to what you do. As I showed you already, focus, but there are literally thousands of apps that allow you to manipulate your photographs afterwards. This is a panorama I took right here at Archbold Scrub. I think I used 2 or 3 different apps to create this image. I wanted it to be in black and white, but the icons down at the bottom are for different apps that you can use. Lightroom, which is part of Adobe, is really easy to use on your phone. Photoshop Express is another app that's sort of a mini version of Photoshop, but it's amazing the tools that are available to you just on your cell phone. Another one is Camera Plus. It not only allows you to manipulate it, but you can even take pictures within the app, and it provides you manual controls that you don't often have with your cell phone. If you want to get really creative, the next icon is for an app called Obscura, and it essentially recreates what pinhole cameras are like, which are really just the most primitive forms of cameras, but they make beautiful photographs. And then the last one is a program called CVSO, which again gives you additional controls, but allows you to really manipulate your imagery, including putting text on it or creating tints and things like that. So you're not limited at all by a cell phone. You can create imagery that's just as spectacular as the imagery on your DSLR, and that's creative and aesthetic and is exactly what we need to be able to tell your story about nature and what you saw and what you felt. If you're out in the woods, don't despair if you've left your camera on at home. Pull out your cell phone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Reed. I'll let Dustin get himself ready. While he does, you've inspired me to go and try lots of things on my own camera, so my own cell phone, so I suspect others are doing the same. So over to you, Dustin, and excited to hear what you've got to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us to learn about photography and think about photography. I have the fortunate job of working at Archbold, where I'm in a nature preserve every day and surrounded by scientists doing all kinds of different interesting projects. And it didn't take me very long after I got here 7 years ago to realize there were a lot of stories that I could tell with photography. And I've got different kinds of lenses to tell those stories with. What I thought I'd do today is talk about is the most fun kind of lens, which is a wide angle lens. And this is the one that most of the photos I'm going to show you are taken with. When you're looking at pictures, It might seem almost like they just appear spontaneously, right? Wow, that's a great shot. But as you learn about what different lenses do, you'll start to see that the photographer made a specific choice over what lens to use. So I'm going to show you some pictures with wide-angle lenses, some without wide-angle lenses, and show you the kinds of subject matter you can photograph and how the photo will be different depending on the lens that you use. Before I jump into it, I do want to say that even if you don't have a DSLR like this, you can get a wide-angle lens for your cell phone, and this just clips right onto a cell phone. So even if you don't have the money for one of those, this only costs about $30, $40. What is conservation photography? Hillary already did a nice job explaining this. But basically the idea is that it's not just about taking the photo, it's about what you do with the photo. How is your picture going to work? How is it helping conservation? If you love nature, you can use your photos to help support nature. I love the second part of this quote. The nature photograph shows a butterfly on a pretty flower. The conservation photograph shows the same thing, but with a bulldozer coming at it in the background. You can have beautiful photos that are conservation photos, ones that look the same as any other nature photo, but you can also have pictures of things that are ugly. And the talk after this one that Bill gives will be a nice example of photographing some of the upsetting stories about what happens in nature when it gets polluted. Well, I can't really talk about angle photography without talking about what it is, because I know many of you might not actually know what this topic is. There's all different kinds of lenses. You might have heard the term zoom lens before. That just means a lens that can move in and out. Telephoto is one that looks further away. A wide angle is one that lets you see a wide angle. And they're generally shorter barreled. If you imagine a big long lens as looking like a tube, looking through a tube, you're not actually going to see that much. You're just going to see in. So the lens that I have here is actually 15 millimeters, which is an ultra wide angle lens. So I'm going to show you pictures with that, and then another lens that's 22. Both of those are very wide. One comment on the part here that says full frame or APS-C. If you don't know what that means, most digital cameras until a couple of years ago had a smaller sensor than the old film 35 millimeter film spot there. So when you attached a 35 millimeter lens onto a digital camera 5 years ago, it was actually being cropped because the sensor wasn't as big as a 35 millimeter piece of film. So you put a 35 on there and it was really a 50. These days, a lot of the cameras coming out are full frame. So the numbers are just becoming regular again. They're not getting cropped. Here's two landscape pictures, and not all the pictures I'm going to show are from Florida or have to do specifically with conservation, but just pictures I've taken all over the place. The one on the left is in New York, near Syracuse, New York, where I'm originally from. The one on the right is from Western Canada. So take a look at both of those and try to figure out which one is with the wide angle and which one is the telephoto. You'll notice the one on the left is a bit abstract looking. We don't see the sky. We are seems like we're looking from far away, looking inward. The one on the right feels more like we are in the space, surrounded by the space. That's because the one on the right is the wide angle. This picture includes both what I love about wide angle, but also one of the challenges or problems with shooting with a wide angle. you can make anything look interesting. It's in some ways, it's the lazy man's camera lens, because just a tiny move this way or that way, and you can really change what your picture looks like. I was just driving down the road in California and stopped and took this. One of the things that I like about wide angle is if you have something interesting in your foreground, in the area closest to you, it will really highlight that, like the X in the road here. But the things that are further in the background don't tend to matter as much. If you don't have something real interesting in the foreground, it's going to look kind of like a flat image, kind of a boring image. And in this case, those mountains back there, which normally might make up their own interesting photo, they're playing second stage to what is in the foreground. Here's a landscape. We're back in Florida here. And this one you can see is 105 millimeters. This is a telephoto. So we can get a nice, idea of what this habitat looks like. It's real pretty. This is at Kissimmee Prairie State Park. But with this one, it feels like we're a little further back again, looking in on it. Now I've got my wide angle and I'm right out there, and I feel like, boom, I'm right in the middle. There's no separation between me and the habitat. I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but that is the main point I want to make with a wide angle, is it gives you this different feel. If you're thinking about the storytelling part of this, I think it matters, because the visuals that you have here are also connected to the emotional tone of your photo. Are we looking from further away, pondering, or are we right in there? It's a little bit like when you're writing, if you use past tense or tense. I think of the wide angles as using present tense. Having a person in the image is always, I love putting people in there. It gives a little bit of a perspective. One thing that's always good in photography is to know where you want the person's eye to go, to have a clear subject. Putting a person in there helps a lot with that. Again, we can see those mountains that are further in the background. In some ways are playing, second string here to the foreground. In this case, I love it. I'm really happy with this picture, because this is an interesting foreground, especially when we put the researchers studying a rare butterfly. This is in the Canadian Rockies. Groups of people. You don't have to just photograph beautiful landscapes with this lens. You can photograph people. So again, we've got two pictures. One's with the wide angle, one's with regular telephoto lens. Which is which? Hopefully at this point, it's making sense to you. The one on the left is the wide angle. The one on the right is the telephoto. I like both of these pictures, and what I want you to think about is that you have tools in your toolkit. If you're a musician and you're writing a song, do you play this instrument or do you choose to play that instrument? It's going to give you a different feel. This is a similar thing that's happening. It's people out with their binoculars looking for birds, groups of people. The one on the right has more of a, romantic feel with that lighting coming in. We've got our subjects in focus, everything else out of focus, which is normal when you're zooming in. What you notice on the wide angle is everything's in focus. Everything's in focus. In this case, I did bring a couple different lenses out there, and I was switching lenses back and forth, but I ended up really liking the wide angle shot. Wide angle lenses for portraits are tricky because they do provide distortion. And you have to think about what distortion you're going to get. If you get real close to people and photograph them, you might make their nose look like it's growing one way, or their forehead will be really big. So just be aware. But remember, everything is in focus and you can fit a lot in there. and you feel like you're very present, and that can be really fun for a portrait too. Usually when I'm doing portraits though, I am zooming in. And the one on the photo on the right of Xochitl is what the portraits I take usually look like, where I'm zooming in on them and having the background go out of focus a bit. But I did want to include the one on the left here of Alicia, because that at first glance looks like maybe it was shot with a wide angle, but you can see it's not. It's at 70 millimeters. So you can get a lot of detail in there with a telephoto lens. But you just have to stand back a lot further. And this also doesn't give us any distortion. Those trees look nice and straight, whereas with the wide angle, they would have been curving a little bit. Actually, when I took that one on the left, I was a little bit surprised, very pleasantly surprised. I was able to get a picture like this using a telephoto. When you want to take photographs of things really close up, you use something called a macro lens. And these are not macro lenses, but you can get very close to things. And sometimes you can use them as if they're a macro lens. But you do have a difference, which is you can play around with everything pretty much being in focus, having a really wide depth of field, a big long depth of field. Now, on the one on the left, the background is out of focus because I am right on top of these flowers. I mean, here's the flower. I am, just a couple inches away from it. So there's no way it was going to get to focus on all of that was in the background. But typically with this, if I have it set for the infinity focus, anything that's about 6 feet away and beyond is all in focus. If I'm getting up close and I've got to change my focus to get something nearer, then I'm going to lose those things further away. But even so, you're still going to be able to include them. I love the shot on the right. That's a grizzly bear print in the mud. And I didn't want to just show the print. I wanted to show the habitat that it was in. And for me, wanting to tell stories about science and conservation, it's important to not just show pretty things or just show one subject at a time, but to give it context. This is the type of shot that you just couldn't do without having a wide angle lens. Science in action. I love getting to go out with researchers and I'll say, oh, what are you doing? Let me go out and take pictures. And they'll say, well, we're counting stems or we're cutting up grasses and putting it in a bag. And that doesn't seem very exciting to them. And with a regular lens, it might not even look that exciting. But I'll tell you, when you've got a wide angle lens on, you can make anything look interesting because you can get so close, get right up to people, and then you can, just by moving a little bit one way or another, really play with how their bodies fit inside of your frame, play with those compositions. I just think they're a lot of fun. I like trying different perspectives, being a little above people. I love getting right on, just laying on the ground. And with the wide angle, laying on the ground, shooting up at a person makes a great shot. A lot of times with a wide angle, you are going to get a lot of sky in your pictures. And, that might be just negative space, just looking white or gray. It's not always a beautiful blue sky with beautiful clouds. So by getting lower and having that wide angle, you can have, like in the picture on the right, just some grass blades going up, and they end up filling up and doing something interesting with all that negative space. Again, getting right on the ground with the researchers. In the one on the right, that's a nice example of making the viewer feel like you're right there in the scene. Sometimes you want to mix it up a little bit. Here's Greg Thompson with a Florida grasshopper sparrow. And the one on the right, I am right there with him. I've got my camera real low, looking up so I can see it. But, the wide angle is not good for everything. So then I've also got the 122 millimeter there looking at the bird in his hands. Perhaps the best thing about a wide angle is you can shoot anywhere, even in just the back of a truck here. That's the photographer, Carlton Ward Jr. Some people might know him. He's a National Geographic photographer. He does a lot of work with Archbold. There we can, I'm just sitting in the back seat and I'm able to get all that detail in with a wide angle. You can add visual drama and play with distortion. So the one on the left, that's my wife. We're in a cave, and I could have gotten a cool shot of her just, you know, getting more close up to her. But with that wide angle lens, I was able to put a lot of space around here and really show the size of this cave we're in and how small she looked inside of it. The right is a bowling alley that was destroyed during Hurricane Irma in Sebring, Florida. And I was talking earlier about foreground and wide angle being important because it's really going to be highlighted and even distorted a little bit. So I got low to the ground while photographing this building, and you can see it's distorting it a little bit, but I think in a good way. Again, well, this is doing a couple things. There's a little bit of distortion here. I'm there up close right there, and I'm able to really play around with how this composition works too. So another example of how you can play with these, you know, make sure you pay attention to what's in the foreground, make it something interesting. Sometimes these might seem even a little bit weird, and maybe they even seem a little too weird to you, but I like the pictures that are a little bit distorted. To me, I just find it interesting. Here's the last picture I want to show you. And this is the one we used for the flyer. I think it is a really good example of what a wide angle does, for better or worse. I love it, but you can see the distortion here is incredible. The horse's head is the same size as his entire body, right? Like the horse's eyeball is the size of his head in this. And it all is in focus mostly, so it's hard to tell like which is supposed to be closer or further away. It's kind of odd and bizarre looking, but I love the composition that it makes. And I like following the lines around, the shapes that it makes. So I want to end with that picture, and hopefully the next time you're looking at photos, you'll start to spot what type of lens they were used with. And I hope you get a chance to play around with a wide angle. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. I look forward to some questions and answers after Bill's talk.
So thank you very much, Dustin. Appreciate it. Actually, I was going to point out to our participants that I noticed Carlton Ward had actually joined us, and maybe if we have a few minutes after our last talk and he's still able to stay on, we could welcome him on our conversation as well. Bill, I was going to hand over to you, and your title is going to be When No One Cares, which is, I hope you're going to make us care. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. Laura, I'm getting a note here, the host disabled participant sharing.
Okay.
Okay, try it now.
Looks good.
Thank you. Okay, well, hey, everybody. So this is going to be a little bit different type of conservation photography, and the hope is that perhaps it will make you feel something. So I'm going to go through a few maps here at the beginning, and then we'll go through the photos. So this is a map. I'll get into you'll see the location in a minute, but where those red triangles are located is where I took a bunch of photographs a bunch of years ago that I'm going to show here in another minute. And just one other thing I want to say before I move on from this photograph is if everyone will just notice the amount of off-road vehicle use that has damaged the habitat here, particularly on the foreground side of that dirt road. And so this is the property you were, in the foreground is what's called Hen Scratch, and the background is what's called Jack Creek. And those properties are located, whoops, let me go back here. Those properties are located about halfway between Sebring and Lake Placid. They're both about the same size of about 1,300 acres. But the story and the whole title of this about When No One Cares has to do with the Hen Scratch site, which wasn't fenced. And the reason it couldn't be fenced was, you can see that the State Conservation Agency did not own all this property. And how do you fence something in when you don't own all of it? And because it wasn't fenced, then the police couldn't enforce any trespassing violations, couldn't enforce anything. So this area just became a party area for years and years and years. The conservation area, though, actually has great value. So this is a 2018 report in the lower right-hand corner from Audubon J-Botch program, showing 6 scrub jay groups in this area in 2018. I understand the 2019 report showed 8 scrub jay groups. So looking at those grouping there, you can see the dotted yellow polygons with things like 2A, 2J written in them. And what that means is 2 adults, 2 juveniles. So in one others, I guess there's 3 adults, 1 juvenile. So juveniles for this endangered species, the scrub jay, is a very good thing, right? It's showing that the species is expanding. And the estimate on these 2 areas is for Hen Scratch that this area could actually contain 16 groups of scrub jays, and the Jack Creek site could carry 13 groups. Right now, there aren't any in Jack Creek. I think some have been seen there. It's not been officially verified, though. So, but the point is that this is valuable land that should be conserved and should be taken care of. So I'm going to show a series of photos here. I'm just going to let this go on automatic. And I'm not going to say anything. And then at the end, I'll come back online here. So here we go. Okay, everybody still with me here? So yeah, this was grim. It is meant to convey a grim message and show how areas that no one cares about can be really taken advantage of. So just to go on to a little bit better note, this area, the hand scratch area, did get fenced in and it did get cleaned up, right? So, you know, the hope by the state conservation agencies is from here on that that area will stay intact, fairly pristine, and endangered species like scrub jays can continue to thrive there. So I've got one more saying. And that's really my presentation. I've just got a couple more slides here on how the pictures were taken or about how the pictures were taken. So one was when I was going through these pictures for this, I had forgotten that I had been injured and I was actually on crutches at this time. And given that, I was not carrying a big old camera around out there. So as Reed pointed out earlier, I did have a cell phone, and almost all of the pictures that you saw there were just taken with a cell phone while I crutched my way around out there. I did have a few of those pictures were with a point and shoot. And then technically on the pictures here, I've got a before and after of what they look like in color and what they look like where I altered how they look to have a certain impact. So these photos were not intended to be a pleasing landscape picture, right? They were intended to be a bit harsh. And then just one note for anybody interested, there's a comment there if you want to read it through about the actual processing that I used in Adobe Lightroom. You can read that as you wish. Right, and there's the picture. And that's the presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Well, before we move on to the panel section, I'd really, well, first of all, encourage everyone to put any questions you have, any technical questions or observations or thoughts in the Q&A so that we can respond to them, or if you have to in the chat box, but the Q&A is the best place to do that, that little button on the bottom of your Zoom panel. And then really my deep gratitude to our three speakers for just such wonderful different presentations and different perspectives that have certainly enlightened me. Before we maybe go on to the panel, I noticed Carlton Ward is with us, and I wondered, Carlton, we can unmute you if you'd like to make a couple of observations or add a few words into it before we go on to answering some Q&As. Yes.
Hey guys, I'll just say hello. I don't want to get in the way of any of the questions that people certainly have for the presenters, but I, for once in a blue moon, was actually at my desk and saw this come through. I'm like, that sounds like much more interesting than the emails I'm supposed to be writing and returning right now. So it's really really a pleasure to see the different perspectives and see the work and the passion and connection to these places. And yeah, I'm happy to be a friend to Archbold and to everyone who presented, and admire everything you guys are doing.
So I'll add that Carlton is in the middle of a very big project, Path of the Panther, in conjunction with National Geographic, and that will be featuring some immensely powerful conservation photography. So check it out, everybody, and see how see how that is developing. And he has inspired us and also lifted our photography up here. So we're deeply appreciative of the relationship between him and the Florida Wildlife Corridor as well. So thanks for being there, Carlton. It was great fun to see your name there. Okay, I'm going to move on. Yeah, I'm going to move on to Laura and let her mediate the questions. So over to you, Laura.
All right, you guys, I have a couple of questions. The first couple of questions are for Dustin, so I'm going to spotlight you for a minute. Felipe says, do you correct for distortion from a wide angle lens in post?
Thanks, Felipe. You can, depending on the software that you're using. In Photoshop, it's really easy to do that. I usually don't. I think if I'm going to put on that, if I'm going to put this lens on here, I'm going to have fun with it and try to use its character. So yeah, it's not hard to do. I think there's even phone apps too where you can even fix distortion, but I usually don't.
All right, and Angela would like to know, is there a way for cell phones to take wide angle photos? That might be a Reed question.
Well, I have mentioned that this is a wide angle lens right here for cell phones that you just clip right on here. But Reed, do you want to do that one too?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of ways. Like Dustin said, there's attachments that you can get that put on. I don't think the lens attachments for cell phones have quite gotten to the optical quality that we have for regular cameras, but they're still good. You can use the panorama to simulate that. And some of the newest phones, like the new iPhone, has a special wide angle lens now. I haven't seen the quality of it, but it allows you to take much wider images than you normally would with the standard lens on a cell phone.
Awesome. All right, and following along with that, we had a question from Casey that asked, what are the advantages of the newer iPhone camera features? Do you have anything to add about other features?
Well, the newest iPhone has that wide angle lens, but they also have a mode called dark mode, which allows you to take really high quality images in very, very dark situations for things like nighttime photography or urban photography where we want to capture lights at night. Again, I've only seen just pictures, photographs of what it takes. I haven't been able to use it myself, but that's supposed to be really great. That is one of the big limitations of cell phones because the sensor size is so small. They don't take really high quality lenses. Most of the ways of doing it now are computer programs that simulate it. But I've heard that they're really high quality.
All right. Well, a question for Bill. Deborah says, great work, everyone. And she'd like to know, where is Hen Scratch in relation to Archbold?
So Hen Scratch probably is about 15 miles north of Archbold, and it's halfway between Lake Placid and Sebring. And if you want to think about when you're on, if you are traveling between Lake Placid and Sebring, and you're driving along US 27, it's going to be about a mile to the west when you cross over Josephine Creek.
All right, I have another question for Dustin. Linda asked, what is the best way to avoid having something in the foreground that you don't want? For example, a parking lot with lots of cars if you are higher up in a building.
Gosh, I don't know which way to answer that. If it's a place you can keep going back to, sometimes just like if you want to see wildlife, you got to keep going back. Find the one day when there's not, or time of day when there's not cars there, or you can Photoshop it out if you're good at that. With the actual lens itself, if you've got a wide angle lens, you're getting everything in there, so it could be tough to do that. But on the other hand, because the wide angle distorts and you only need a little bit of foreground, and you can turn that little bit into a lot just by aiming your camera down a little bit or getting lower, you wouldn't necessarily need a whole big parking lot, just a little bit, and get down close. Hope that helps answer that one.
Okay. So while you're here, someone who got on late, they apologize if you mentioned it earlier. Could you offer suggestions on any particular wide angle lenses that you've enjoyed using?
I mean, I'm not getting sponsored or anything, but I love this lens. I did show it at the beginning of mine, but the brand is IRIX. They make several different lenses. This is the only one that I have. This is about a $700 lens. It's 15 millimeters and it's a prime lens. What that means is that it doesn't go in and out. It's just always 15 millimeters. It does not have automatic focusing. So that is a big thing, but when you're using a wide angle lens, it's not that big of a deal. You set it for infinite focus and anything that's 6 feet or more is in focus. The reason I originally bought it was that the Pentax brand lens that was similar to this was twice as much money. So I went with this one because it was half the price, but actually really like it a lot.
Nice. All right, I'm going to go back to Reed. Scott says, one of the issues of printing cell pics is the lower resolution compared to DSLR pics when you're blowing it up. Any tips on enhancing the cell pics for this purpose?
No, I restrict myself to using cell phones for screen, web, things like that. I've never been satisfied with printing them. Certainly, you know, an 8x10 maybe is fine, but beyond that, again, the screen size is so small, the sensor size is so small. Even though they say they're 12, 14 megapixels, that's not the only thing that demonstrates the resolution. And pixel density is another one. So, but yet, a lot of conservation photography is achieved online. So there's plenty of applications for your cell phone photography beyond blowing it up and printing them. Sorry.
Okay, so I have another iPhone question, but the other guys may want to chime in on this one too. Gail says, on iPhone, light colors in real close-up shots are hard on details of subject matter. Is there a solution?
Well, if you guys want to chime in too, but on any phone, remember that the exposure is an average of all the different light intensities that the camera's recording. And light colors, if the photograph's just a little bit exposed, light colors are really easy to blow out. What I like to do is actually put my finger on some of the light subjects and focus for them. The other thing, and this may get too technical, but all the digital cameras now come with something called a histogram, which is actually just a graph that shows you what's being exposed correctly and what's not. And you can slide the exposure down so that the highlights, those brightest spots in your camera are exposed and not blown out. But for me, the simplest way is to just put my finger on that light flower until the camera readjusts its exposure for that, and then take the photograph.
All right, and here's another one. Did you guys have something else?
Yeah, if I could just add to that. You know, in my talk, I was saying how when you start looking at photos now, you're going to notice ones that are taken with wide angles. Once you start thinking about light, you'll notice there's a lot of photos that you see. Seems like a lot of times they're black and white, but not always. That has maybe it's a flower or something that's a bright color, or maybe there's just light shining on it, which is gorgeous. And then everything else is really dark behind it. And the photographer's probably using it artistically. But what they saw with their eyes visually did not look like that. But what Reed is saying is that your camera can only choose one exposure. So if you expose for that bright thing, the rest will go out of focus, and the rest will go darker. And sometimes that can be a really fun artistic tool to play with.
Great. So I'll keep you on the screen for this one, and then the other guys can also chime in again. If you're carrying a DSLR in the field, what lens or combination of lenses do you recommend taking with you? This is a question from Doug.
For me, it depends on what I'm out there to do and how long of, how far are you going out there? How hot is it that day? I've got a nice case. This is the backpack that I use, so I can fit a lot in there. But I don't always want to carry that around when it's 90 degrees out. So I usually just pick one. Usually it's either this or it's my 70 to 200. What about you guys?
Yeah, I almost always use it. I actually have a much wider range. I have an 18 to 200 zoom that's pretty good, and I keep that on my camera most of the time.
Yeah, and I think in my case, maybe this is the same as what Dustin just said, but you know, with my DSLR, I'll use a 24 to 70, or I'll take a 24 to 70 and also a 70 to 200. And sometimes I wish I had a 500 or 600 zoom, but generally can get by with a 70 to 200.
Okay. I have a question for you, Bill, from Curtis. In telling the story of No One Cares, how did you select the particular photos? Did you omit some of the photos that you took? Did you keep hoping for other photos?
Well, those photos were taken on 2 different weekends, and they were actually taken when the area was getting cleaned up. I had to be there, but I couldn't help because I was injured. And so it was, you know, easy enough for me to just go around with a camera and take pictures. So, you know, the good news is that it's all cleaned up. The bad news is that it was actually many, many, many more pictures. But how many pictures of dumped old swimming pools, you know, do I need to show to make the point that people dumped swimming pools there, right? So I would just pick the one, you know, best picture for each category and use that one. Maybe another thing, this may have been a parent, but I also tried to have the pictures in some sequence that made sense, that told a story from beginning to end.
If I could jump in too to add to that, I think it shows a lesson that photography has been around for a while, but it's always had this feel that it's real or unbiased. And I think showing Bill's story is really important because it shows how much the photographer really is picking the reality that you get to see. How often do you see stories like Bill's? Usually that junk is out there, but you're never seeing it in the photos because you aim this way or that way. Okay, there's a rusty park, fence over there, and the photographer doesn't show it. And in some ways, photography is truthful in that it's capturing light and saving it, but it's also just a tool for storytelling. And we need to be, as creators, we need to be aware that we are in charge of that story. We can't let ourselves off the hook. We have to be in charge of every part of that story. But then as viewers, we have to also look for what's the story they're telling us, what are they including, and what are they leaving out. It's not reality, it's one statement. It's like an essay about one point. And I was also wondering if Carlton is still, I see that he's still on. I think he would be really interesting to hear from on that one. How do you make your photo selections? What pictures do you omit when trying to tell stories that include the negative things?
Hey guys, still here. Well, yeah, for me, as a photojournalist, as a conservation photographer, it's about presenting your stories in context. It's about conveying a sense of place, communicating the threat, not just the beauty. This was a topic that's was really on my mind when I was coming up through graduate school around 2000, and I wrote a thesis on the field of conservation photography when it was just emerging as a recognized field. That happened in around 2005, and I interviewed a bunch of my role models at National Geographic, asking them what is the difference between nature photography and conservation photography, or asked them to define each. And I remember Joel Sartori, who's one of my National Geographic role models, said that nature photography shows the butterfly in isolation, conservation photography shows the bulldozer in the background. And so, that's his definition of it. Now, you could have singular, beautiful photographs that don't show any of that, but they're presented by a conservation organization who presents and provides the context. So it's not black or white. Photographs for art's sake can serve conservation purposes when they are activated by conservation partners. Another really interesting thing that came out of that thesis exercise was the kind of recognition that conservation photography was, in every case I looked, achieved in partnership with conservation organizations. And a lot of people know that Ansel Adams, is a famous photographer of the Western landscape. Not everybody knows he was on the board of directors of the Sierra Club for 38 years. And there was a lot of purpose and political intent behind those beautiful images that we recognize. So I don't get me going on this topic. I could take up a lot of time, but I will send to Laura a link to that thesis I wrote, and so she can maybe share it to the group in case anybody's interested.
Great, thank you, Carlton. Let's see, I have another question for the group and then a few more questions for Bill. So we'll go through, what do you guys look for when buying a lens? I know that's kind of broad, but if you have certain things, like I know Dustin talked about which wide angle lens he liked the best.
I would say the balance between cost and optical quality. There's lots of stuff online. You can read reviews, and so you can read about how sharp a lens is, but the sharper the lens or the faster a lens, the more expensive it's going to be. So it's all a trade-off. And it also depends on your purpose. I like Dustin, I had a nice wide angle lens and it cost me a lot of money, but I recently went out and bought an off-brand one that, like Dustin's, doesn't have automatic anything, but I got it because it was really fast, and I bought it very specifically for going out and shooting nighttime skies, and it's performed spectacularly.
I think for me, when I got into this, I decided that I'd get into it seriously. And so I'd go for, as Reed used the phrase, a fast lens, which means it has a very low aperture rating. Typically on my two lenses, the 24-70 and the 70-200, they're both f2.8 lenses. And there is a price that one ends up paying for that type of fast lens. So anyway, that's what I'm looking for, is a fast lens also.
And really that just means that they...
Sorry, go on, Reed.
Well, a fast lens really just, or a large aperture, just means that they're really good at gathering light. So you can use them in very low light conditions. Also, because a fast lens has very shallow depth of field, you see these pictures with these beautifully blurred out backgrounds. You can only get that with a fast lens.
I think they answered that, but I'll just say it's fun. I enjoy reading reviews and watching videos of reviews. Before I picked this lens, I spent a few hours at least watching reviews and reading reviews before I picked it. That could be very stressful for some people, but I think it's really fun because I'm not gonna be able to buy all those lenses, but I can still watch the reviews.
Great. All right. Let's see. We have a few more questions for Bill. The first is Hen Scratch open to the public?
Well, the official answer is no. The unofficial answer is if you are in there walking around, you know, not on a vehicle, that no one's going to say anything and no one's going to care. One of the ways to see it, if you're interested, would be when Audubon Jaywatch starts back up. I think there's some challenges this year due to the coronavirus pandemic, but when Jaywatch starts back up, Jaywatch does go into Hen-Scratch to do its surveys in there.
I have a question from Doug that he hikes he's hiked for several years in the Scrub State Park, and he's seen a lot of activity like the illegal ATV use and dumping and in the trash like you showed. He wants to know what's the best place to report this activity.
Well, yeah, I wish I'd seen that question. That's interesting. If it's literally in Lake June Scrub State Park, that people are going in there on ATVs. So the best place by far to report that would be to the state park system. And there, you know, Highlands Hammock State Park manages Lake June Scrub State Park. So that would be the best place. And they would then engage the right law enforcement to deal with that. That's also surprising to hear for Scrub State Park that there's debris being dumped in there. But again, I would contact Highlands Hammock about that.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment from Sabine that I would just like to read. It says, Bill, you did a great job in obtaining the emotions you probably were aiming for. I feel upset seeing how people trash nature's beauty and potentially kill it. I think we all feel that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it had some impact. I hope everybody realizes it's all fixed now.
Yeah, that's really good to know.
And
all right.
I'd like to say with Bill's that's really depressing, but keep in mind that last part too, that all those pictures showing all those volunteers. So the Ridge Rangers that Bill used to run, they do amazing work. So if that stuff upsets you and you're thinking, what can you do? Look up the Ridge Rangers. They do all kinds of volunteer work that's habitat restoration work.
Great. One more question for Bill. How do you share your photos to make people aware of the subjects you're trying to show others?
So I fail miserably at that. I don't really have a good way of doing it. This is probably one way. I have given a few talks here and there. But you know, the number one way I'm really working towards is with Archbold and working there on a conservation communications method. So that's really where I'm headed, is with Archbold.
Excellent. So there's a couple more questions. This one's from Lexi, and it's for anybody. How would you suggest members of the audience begin to tell stories with their photos rather than just taking visually pleasing pictures?
You know, since I'm up, I'll just go ahead and just say, if something is moving you, if something is giving you a feeling inside, good or bad, you know, seeing a beautiful bird or an incredible scene, if it somehow is creating a feeling within you, go with that feeling and try to capture that with your camera.
I'll add to be authentic to yourself. You know, Lexi is one of the researchers here. So she's intimately involved with conservation projects, but really anybody that's going outside has their own story to tell. So you don't need to necessarily know the Latin name for that species and its whole history in order to add a conservation message when you share it online. Maybe you're visiting a state park and you have a simple message of, it was so wonderful to be out here today. This is why I loved it. And then I'm so grateful that we have our state park system. Or what, you know, it doesn't have to be that you have to know all of that stuff. So I would just add, be authentic to yourself when you're trying to tell your story.
And I would just add, because I have a slightly different approach. I have a zillion stories in my head. I'm not often going out. I'm not a professional photographer. I don't go out necessarily to take photos to tell a story. But I see images all the time that fit into the zillions of stories that are in my head. And so I'm constantly taking pictures that are a small part of a larger story that eventually I want to tell. And so often I just go through my archives and find the pictures that help me tell a particular story. And then sometimes I go out to get them specifically for a story.
Okay, well, thanks you guys. This was fantastic. We have one more question for Carlton, if he would like to participate in this one. It's from Casey, who asked about the corridor. We've been following your corridor work. Any updates on the progress that you'd like to share?
Well, it's going to be a tough legislative year because of COVID, so it's hard to articulate our exact call to action right now. But we are, I think I can safely say, we are working toward trying to get legislation, or at least formal designation, of the Florida Wildlife Corridor as a state conservation priority. We've had some success in conversations at DEP at the Department of Environmental Protection about that, and we're working on making a short film with the National Geographic Society this summer that's going to communicate the virtues of saving a wildlife corridor through Florida from kind of agricultural and economic perspectives to an audience of Florida lawmakers. So the goal with that will be to provide an educational and outreach tool with a lot of prestigious national branding behind it that we can try to advance an agenda with, because we've been telling the story for 10 years, but we need to tell the story more effectively to the people who are making the decisions to translate to that designation and ultimately increased funding for conservation that we're going to need to balance out things like toll roads and other very, we know the development interests have a great plan and great funding, and we need a great plan and great funding for conservation too. So trying to get that story out there. The panther is part of it as well, but the corridor is broader and more multi-dimension. But I will say the reason I've been chasing the story of the Florida panther and using camera traps for the past 4, nearly 5 years is because my editor at National Geographic told me that they were not likely to do a story just about the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but National Geographic would do a story about the Florida panther and use it to tell the story of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so that has been, the biggest photographic challenge of my career, but we're looking at May of 2021 for a National Geographic story about the panther. And so that will be kind of one of the tools in the toolkit for advocating for the corridor. So that's a long answer, but the FloridaWildlifeCorridor.org and Jason Lauritsen, the executive director, are great sources of information on that, and they do a good newsletter. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you haven't already.
Hey, and Bill got one last question in really quickly. He says, what is a good way or software to tag photos you want to bring up later?
So this is somebody's asking Bill Parken that question?
This person's name is Bill.
Okay. Well,
but you can go for it.
Right. I bet many of us could, everybody on the panel could handle it, but I for sure use Adobe Lightroom. All photographs from whatever camera, a GoPro, goes into my Adobe Lightroom, and I tag them as I import them into Adobe. And I also geotag all photos. I generally have a GPS on me, or the system I'm using has got a GPS built into it. And so either from written tags as I enter those photos into Adobe, or the geotagging, or both, I can go back and find photos later.
I use Lightroom too, and I have a keyword system. I keyword all my photos. I don't geotag them, but I also organize them by date. That's the only way I organize them. But everything's got a caption and keywords, so I can usually find them. Lightroom also has some great things. You can store your photos, but then you can create these things called virtual collections. So you could have, say, a collection of all the photos that you have that have the keyword bird, and that's separate. It's not actually a different physical file, it's just virtual, but it allows for a tremendous amount of flexibility. You can create a zillion collections. You could have one for Florida, one for birds.
I use Photoshop, and then it comes with something called Bridge. You also get Lightroom when you purchase Photoshop too, but I don't use it very often. I'm definitely way behind Bill and Reed in terms of how I catalog. I just go by dates. I have some main categories, and then I make folders with dates inside of that. But I do use the rating system a lot. If I do a photo shoot, I might take 2,000 photos. And when I go through them, I'll give them 4 or 5 stars to the ones I like and slowly whittle them down that way.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, you guys. We have gone through all the questions. So I appreciate everybody's time, and thanks again to Carlton for chiming in.
Thank you, everyone. This was great.
Thank you.
Yes. So I will just say thanks again to everybody who attended today. Join us again next Thursday at 3:30 for a special distinguished guest speaker, Dr. John Fitzpatrick of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Archbold Board of Directors, as he presents How Birds Can Save the World, Lessons from eBird, the world's largest citizen science project. Also next week on Tuesday at 9:30 a.m., Dustin Angell leads our virtual field trip series with a visit to a seasonal pond. Bye, everybody. Thanks again.